Flight attendant laughs at Black Billionaire's appearance, but faces backlash. Online, we explore a shocking incident that took place aboard a commercial flight where a flight attendant made a regrettable mistake. The story begins when a successful Black billionaire, traveling for business, faced an unexpected reaction from a flight attendant. Unbeknownst to the attendant, her reaction would soon become a lesson in humility and respect. Tell us whether you find great excitement in this narrative. Press 1 if the video delighted you. Press 0 otherwise not. Your comments really motivate me to compile more inspiring and significant narratives.
Juliet Davis adjusted the sharp lines of her white pantsuit as she made her way through the terminal. The click of her heels echoed on the polished marble floor, harmonizing with the chorus of conversations and rolling suitcases that surrounded her. It was the familiar rhythm of travel, one she had come to know well. In her hand was a carefully folded boarding pass for a first-class seat, a physical reminder of all the years she had spent earning her place in spaces once closed to her. The boarding process was smooth. Juliet moved through the crowd with a presence that was deliberate yet unassuming, an expert at blending in and observing the world around her without making a spectacle of herself. As she reached the gate, she smiled politely at the flight attendant standing by the door. The smile was not returned. "Are you sure you're in the right line, ma'am?" the attendant asked, her tone polite but laced with an unspoken judgment. There was something about her words, something that suggested this was not just a simple query. Juliet handed over her boarding pass, her demeanor calm, her confidence unshaken. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice unwavering. The attendant's gaze lingered on the ticket a moment too long, her fingers pressing it too firmly as she scanned it. A small, almost imperceptible sneer tugged at the corner of her mouth before she stepped aside. Juliet moved forward without a second glance, her back straight, her expression serene. In her mind, a quiet recognition stirred, not anger, but familiarity. She had felt this before, the subtle dissection of her right to exist in certain spaces. It wasn't new, nor was it unexpected. But what did surprise her, even if only a little, was how the sting of that judgment had not dulled over time. First class, yet excluded. Settling into her first-class seat by the window, Juliet exhaled deeply, allowing the gentle hum of the plane's engines to fill the silence around her. Outside, the tarmac glistened in the soft light of the morning sun, the world beyond bustling with preparations for journeys that spanned continents. She opened a book, an old favorite, and let her fingers trace the worn edges of its pages. Books, like airplanes, had always been her escape. They were vessels that transported her to places where she could move freely without the constraints of others' judgments. But peace was fleeting. The flight attendants began distributing drinks, and as they passed, Juliet noticed the same attendant from the gate, Clara. She bypassed Juliet's row entirely, her focus elsewhere, ignoring the passengers seated in the premium section. Juliet watched, still as a statue, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She didn't press the call button. Not yet. When Clara returned, her tray laden with refreshments, Juliet finally spoke. "Excuse me, could I have some water?" she asked, her voice gentle. Clara barely spared her a glance, her response sharp and dismissive. "I'll see what I can do." Some minutes later, a bottle of water appeared, dropped onto Juliet's tray with barely concealed disdain. Juliet caught it easily, her movements slow, measured, composed. She glanced at Clara, offering a polite, "Thank you." But the attendant was already walking away. The air between them was charged with something unspoken. The tension was palpable, an invisible wall separating Juliet from the rest of the cabin. She could feel the whispers, the occasional glances from other passengers who had witnessed the interaction. But she said nothing. She was used to this. Years of navigating the cutthroat world of fashion had taught her the value of patience. But patience, she reminded herself, was not the same as complacency. She had learned to endure, but that didn't mean she would forget. The small acts of disdain. As the flight continued, the small infractions mounted. A menu was skipped during meal service, a muttered remark. "Some people just don't belong here," whispered with venom as Clara passed by. Each act was small enough that no one would have thought twice, but Juliet was paying attention. She always paid attention. Her calm remained unbroken, but in the quiet space of the cabin, in the privacy of her seat, she opened her bag and pulled out a notebook, its pages filled with sketches and notes for her upcoming presentation in Paris. Today, however, the notebook would serve a different purpose. With the precision of an artist capturing a delicate design, Juliet began to write. She recorded Clara's behavior with the same care she would give to a garment, detailing every interaction, every glance, every word. In the quiet of her seat, she was constructing a record, one that would leave no room for doubt. Every detail had power. It was a power that Clara had underestimated. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane climbed to cruising altitude, and Juliet stared out at the endless expanse of clouds. Her reflection faint against the glass. She was reminded of something she had always known. The world didn't always welcome those who looked like her, but she had never let that stop her. The confrontation. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts as the plane steadied in the sky. Juliet pressed the call button. Clara appeared moments later, her thinly veiled irritation obvious. "Yes?" she asked, her smile forced, as if to mask the discomfort that hung between them. Juliet's voice was steady, calm, too calm. "Is there a problem between us?" she asked. Clara blinked, caught off guard. I don't know what you mean. You've gone out of your way to make this flight uncomfortable for me," Juliet continued, her tone even, yet edged with quiet resolve. "I'd like to know why." For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers, who had been murmuring quietly, fell silent. Clara froze, caught in a moment of vulnerability. She had nowhere to hide. Juliet's gaze remained unwavering. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her calm demeanor said everything. "I treat all passengers the same," Clara muttered, but her words were hollow. They lacked conviction. Juliet tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked on Clara's. "Do you? Because it certainly doesn't feel that way." The air was thick with tension. A storm of emotions brewed between them, silent yet intense. Clara had no response. "I suggest you reflect on your actions," Juliet said simply, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had endured too much and was no longer willing to let it slide. The rest of the flight. The remainder of the flight passed in an uneasy silence. Clara avoided Juliet entirely, her earlier arrogance replaced by a discomfort that was impossible to ignore. Juliet returned to her notebook, documenting the small details with the precision of someone who understood the power of the written word. Every glance, every word, every moment had a story to tell, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Arrival in Paris. As the plane began its descent into Paris, Juliet closed her notebook and looked out the window at the sprawling city below. She wasn't angry. She wasn't satisfied. What she felt was something deeper, an unwavering determination. This flight, this small moment in time, was only the beginning. A much larger journey awaited her. The taxi wound its way through the streets of Paris, the city's elegant avenues bathed in the late afternoon light. Juliet sat in the back seat, her hands resting lightly in her lap, but her mind far from the serene beauty outside. The events of the flight replayed in her head, vivid and unrelenting. When the car pulled up to her hotel, a grand building adorned with ornate ironwork and glowing in the warm light of the setting sun, Juliet stepped out quietly, offering a soft word of thanks to the driver. Inside the lobby, the weight of the day felt heavier than her carry-on bag. In her suite, Juliet placed her belongings down, walked to the window, and gazed out at the Eiffel Tower in the distance. The symbol of resilience and beauty stood proudly, unyielding against the passage of time. Yet, even its grandeur did little to ease the storm that raged within her. The city's lights twinkled like stars, indifferent to the quiet indignation that she carried. Juliet had endured slights before, both overt and subtle. They came in many forms: a glance, a comment, a quiet judgment. But none of them, not a single one, would ever define her. Not now, not ever. The Eiffel Tower loomed large outside the window, its silhouette etched against the fading Parisian sky. The city's lights twinkled like stars, indifferent to the quiet indignation that simmered beneath Juliet Davis's composed exterior. The weight of the day's events pressed on her, heavier than the rolling suitcase she had left by the door. Juliet had endured slights before, both overt and subtle. A glance too long, a voice dripping with condescension, a whispered question of whether she truly belonged in boardrooms, at dinner parties, or even in boutiques that displayed her own creations. But this was different. Clara's dismissive tone, her open disdain, it struck a chord deeper than anything Juliet had felt before. It wasn't the act itself that lingered, but the cruel reminder it carried. No matter how far she had climbed, the climb was never truly over. The world would always find a way to remind her of her place. And as she stood there, watching the glowing lights of Paris below, she realized something. This time, it wasn't just about the insult. It was about something far greater, something systemic. Juliet poured herself a glass of water, the cool liquid offering a brief reprieve. Her notebook lay on the bedside table, its pages waiting to be filled. For a moment, she hesitated. The weight of her pen seemed heavier than usual, but then, with a deep breath, she picked it up, her fingers steady. She began to write. She documented every detail with precision: Clara's tone, her actions, the deliberate exclusions that had unfolded before her eyes. The facts were stark, unembellished, but undeniable. When Juliet finished, she leaned back, her eyes closed. It wasn't anger she felt, not in the way most would expect. Anger, she had learned long ago, burned bright and fast. But resolve endured. And in that moment, Juliet's resolve hardened like steel. Later that evening, Juliet called Sophie. The sound of her best friend's voice, warm and comforting, greeted her on the other end. "Juliet, I thought you'd be enjoying Paris by now. What's going on?" Juliet recounted the flight with surgical precision, her voice steady and measured. Sophie listened quietly, save for the occasional gasp or exclamation of disbelief. When Juliet finished, there was a long silence before Sophie spoke, her voice firm with indignation. "That's outrageous. You shouldn't have to deal with that, not after everything you've accomplished." Juliet allowed herself a small smile, though Sophie couldn't see it. "It's not about my accomplishments," Juliet replied, her voice calm, but filled with something deeper. "It's about how people like Clara feel so free to act that way, so certain there will be no consequences." Sophie's voice sharpened, filled with the fire of determination. "You're right. This can't just be brushed aside, but what do you want to do about it?" That was the question, wasn't it? Juliet had spent her entire career navigating spaces that weren't built for her, learning when to speak up and when to stay silent. But this felt different. This wasn't just a passing insult. It was a reflection of something much larger, something systemic. "I'm not sure yet," Juliet admitted, her voice softening. But I can't let it end with a sigh and a shrug. It's not just about me, it's about everyone who's ever faced this and been forced to swallow it. Sophie's reply was immediate, her voice brimming with determination. Then don't. Leave it to me. I have connections. Let me reach out to someone at the airline. Juliet's heart lifted at her friend's offer. Thank you, Sophie. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Leave it to me, Sophie promised, her tone unwavering. This kind of behavior thrives on silence. And if there's one thing you're not, Juliet, it's silent. As the call ended, Juliet felt a flicker of something unexpected, a spark of hope. It was fragile, like the first light of dawn, but it was there. She moved to the window again, her reflection faint against the darkening glass. The city stretched out before her, a sprawling canvas of light and life. Paris was known for its ability to embrace reinvention, for its ability to change while retaining its soul. Perhaps, Juliet thought, she could do the same. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, but she knew this. She would not allow herself to be defined by Clara's smallness. There was too much at stake, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been made to feel less than. In the stillness of the room, Juliet's resolve solidified into something unshakable. The path ahead wasn't clear, but she would walk it nonetheless. The climb wasn't over, but she was ready. The café near Place Vendôme was quiet, the kind of place where conversations were low and time seemed to slow. Juliet sat at a small table by the window, her leather notebook resting beside a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the world bustled on, pedestrians meandering past elegant shop windows, couples sharing soft laughter, and bicycles weaving through the cobblestone streets. But inside, the air was thick with anticipation. A conversation of gravity was about to unfold. Charles Merritt arrived precisely on time. His grey hair was neatly combed, his presence both steady and unobtrusive. He greeted Juliet with a firm handshake and a warm, understated smile before sliding into the chair across from her. "Thank you for meeting me," Juliet said, her voice calm but resolute, the undercurrent of her determination unmistakable. Charles nodded. "After what I witnessed on that flight, I'd say it's the least I could do." The quiet between them wasn't born of hesitation, but of shared understanding. Charles opened his leather briefcase and retrieved a notepad, its corners slightly worn. He placed it on the table and began flipping through its pages with quiet purpose. "Let's start at the beginning," he said. "I want to make sure we document everything." Juliet recounted the events with the same precision she had used in her notebook, her words deliberate, never over-dramatized. There was no need for embellishment. The facts spoke for themselves. The condescension in Clara's voice, the deliberate exclusions during meal service, the dismissive remark that lingered in the air like smoke. Charles listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. His expression was one of professional detachment, but Juliet could see the quiet outrage in his eyes. When she finished, Charles set his pen down, his expression a mixture of professionalism and something deeper, a burning sense of justice. He met Juliet's gaze, his voice steady and assured. "This isn't just about a flight attendant's rudeness," he said. "This is about systemic behavior that has to stop. We'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Juliet nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. The wheels were in motion now. This wasn't just about one woman's insult. This was about changing the way the world saw people like her. The climb wasn't over, but together they were ready to fight. Juliet sat in the dim light of her hotel room, her fingers hovering over her laptop keyboard. The weight of the day still lingered, pressing heavily against her chest. She had spent the evening reviewing the events of the flight, her mind replaying Clara's every word, every glance, each subtle cruelty etched into her memory like an indelible mark. But this time, there was no room for silence. Her words, written with meticulous care, captured the raw facts of what had transpired. Clara's dismissive tone, the deliberate exclusion during meal service, the condescending remarks that lingered like a foul scent in the air. Charles, her ally and sounding board, had listened intently, scribbling down notes with a controlled intensity. His reaction had been one of quiet outrage, not just at Clara's actions, but at the systemic behavior that had enabled such treatment to persist unchecked for so long. What Clara did was unacceptable, Charles had said, his voice steady yet filled with quiet anger. But what's worse is that it didn't happen in isolation. I've seen this before, patterns of behavior that continue because no one holds them accountable. Juliet had nodded, her gaze unwavering. That's what troubles me the most. It's not just about her. It's about a system that allows this to continue. Charles leaned back slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table. The question is, how far are you willing to take this? These kinds of fights can be long and draining, especially when it's just one voice against an institution. Juliet didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, allowing herself to absorb the gravity of what Charles had said. She had spent years in rooms where she wasn't expected to succeed, rooms where her presence was a silent challenge to the status quo. As a black woman in an industry steeped in exclusivity, she had learned to endure slights and dismissals, big and small, and to choose her battles carefully. But this time felt different. This time, it wasn't about staying silent. Finally, after a long pause, Juliet spoke. It's not just about me. If I stay silent, Clara's behavior will be repeated with someone else. Someone who might not have the resources or the platform to push back. I can't ignore that. Charles's eyes softened, his expression shifting to one of quiet approval. Then we start with a formal complaint to the airline, clear, factual, and supported by witnesses, if possible. Juliet's mind raced as she thought about the passengers who had been on that flight. She remembered the woman 2 rows ahead who had glanced back, her concern evident. The older man across the aisle who had murmured his disapproval when Clara's hostility became too obvious to ignore. Juliet made a mental note to reach out to them. She would need their support. And if the airline doesn't take it seriously? Juliet asked, her voice firm with growing resolve. Charles met her gaze without hesitation. Then we escalate. Public accountability is often the only thing that gets results. Juliet looked out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The city below was unchanged, the familiar hum of Paris filling the air. But inside her, something had shifted. She wasn't angry, at least not in the way people often think of anger. What she felt was a quiet, simmering resolve, a fire that burned for justice, not for revenge. It was a deep, unwavering need to demand change, to force the system to reckon with the flaws it had allowed to fester unchecked. As their conversation continued, Juliet's clarity deepened. This wasn't just about bringing down an airline or punishing one individual. It was about forcing an entire system to confront its biases, about making sure the behavior she had experienced would no longer be allowed to persist in the shadows. She didn't expect it to be easy. She had faced hard things before, challenges that tested her limits, but she had always found a way through. This would be no different. By the time they parted ways, the plan was set. Juliet would draft the formal complaint that evening, detailing every moment with the precision and care she applied to her designs. Charles would follow up with the airline, ensuring that the complaint wouldn't be buried in bureaucracy. Together, they would push for answers, for accountability. Walking back to her hotel, Juliet felt a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. The city was beginning to glow as the street lamps flickered on, their soft light casting a golden hue over the evening. She thought of the countless people who had likely faced similar treatment, those who had swallowed their indignation, brushed off the offense, and moved on because they felt they had no other choice. She could no longer be one of them. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing: silence was no longer an option. In the quiet of her hotel room, Juliet sat at the small desk, the soft glow of the Eiffel Tower visible through the window behind her. The hum of Paris at night filled the space, muffled voices, distant traffic, the occasional breeze against the glass, creating a backdrop to her thoughts. She had nearly finished the statement she had started drafting earlier that evening. Its tone was carefully measured, its words selected with precision. "This isn't just about one flight or one person," she had written. "It's about a culture that allows such behavior to persist unchecked for years. I've faced these subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, reminders that to some, I don't belong. I'm sharing this not for sympathy, but to shed light on a problem that affects so many who remain unheard." She paused, her gaze lingering on the screen. There was no anger in her words, no theatrical outrage. Instead, there was a quiet insistence, a demand for recognition and accountability. It was the kind of demand that came not from a place of vengeance, but from a belief in the possibility of change. She didn't want the world to see her as a victim, but as someone fighting for something larger than herself. Juliet reread the opening lines several times, ensuring that her message was clear and unapologetically honest. When she was satisfied, she sent the statement to Charles and Sophie for their feedback. She trusted them implicitly. Both understood the importance of tone, of making sure that her message wouldn't be dismissed as overly emotional or self-serving. This wasn't just about her. It was about the broader issue, a system that perpetuated harmful patterns of behavior. Minutes later, Sophie called. "This is perfect," Sophie said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "You've managed to say exactly what needs to be said without making it about revenge. It's powerful." Charles's response arrived by email shortly after. "A few minor edits for clarity, but otherwise this is excellent. If the airline tries to dismiss this, it won't work. Your words leave no room for ambiguity." Juliet felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. She was ready. Her next step was to post the statement to her social media accounts. Over the years, she had built a substantial following, one that respected her work as a designer. But this was not the kind of content her audience was accustomed to seeing. Even so, Juliet knew this was bigger than fashion. This was about using her platform to speak truth to power, to demand change. Her finger hovered over the post button, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. She understood the weight of what she was about to do. This statement would be a declaration, a call to action for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, a plea for justice, and a challenge to the system that had allowed this behavior to persist for so long. And as she pressed post, she knew that this was only the beginning. The fight was just starting, but she was ready. Juliet sat in the glow of her hotel room, the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. As a designer, she was accustomed to the attention her work brought, but this was different. This was not the kind of content her audience was accustomed to seeing. And yet, she understood the importance of speaking out, of using her platform for something far greater than the world of fashion. Her finger hovered over the post button for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of the recognition that once this statement was public, there would be no turning back. She was stepping into a spotlight she hadn't sought, but one she knew she couldn't avoid. The decision was made. With a quiet, resolute breath, Juliet pressed the button. Within minutes, the responses began to flood in, first from friends and colleagues offering their unwavering support, followed by a wave of strangers. Some shared their own stories of similar mistreatment. Others expressed outrage on her behalf. Her phone buzzed incessantly, notifications streaming in, each a reminder of the ripple her words had created. But amid the support, there were the inevitable voices of skepticism. A few questioned her account, dismissing it as an overreaction, wondering about the truth of her experience. Juliet had anticipated this. She had spent too many years in rooms where her confidence was challenged, where the slightest suggestion of doubt was used to undermine her. So, she wasn't surprised by the criticisms. What mattered now wasn't the doubt, but the truth of her story and the people it resonated with. As the hours passed, the story gained momentum. News outlets began picking it up, framing it as part of a broader conversation about racial bias in customer service. Juliet read one headline aloud, her voice steady. World-renowned designer speaks out against discrimination on first-class flight. She placed her phone down, exhaling softly. The framing of the media felt both empowering and reductive. This wasn't about her fame, her position, or the accolades she had achieved. It was about something far larger, the countless, often invisible experiences of discrimination that so many endured without a platform to speak up. Juliet wanted to highlight this truth, not to shine the light on herself, but to shift the focus where it belonged, on the systemic problems that allowed such behavior to flourish. Later that evening, her phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. "You've started something big. Be ready for what's next." Juliet sat by the window, her gaze drifting over the glowing city below. The Eiffel Tower shimmered against the night sky, its lights unwavering. She thought about the passengers on that flight, the man who had offered his support, the murmurings of disapproval from others who had witnessed Clara's actions. They had seen it. They had felt the unease too. Juliet wasn't alone in this fight, though the path ahead would not be easy. She knew the struggle for change was rarely a straight line. It was built on moments like this, when someone chose to speak out instead of remaining silent. And she had chosen to act. As the night deepened, Juliet closed her laptop and reached for her notebook. The pen moved steadily across the pages, her thoughts unfolding in the quiet of her hotel room. The words were not for public eyes this time, they were for herself, a reminder of why she had chosen to speak, a reflection on the quiet strength that had carried her through years of subtle exclusions and overt dismissals. She wrote until the city outside grew silent, her resolve filling the spaces where silence had once reigned. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of an email. Its subject line, deceptively innocuous. Follow-up regarding your experience on Flight 3748. Juliet opened it with careful anticipation. The light from her laptop cast a soft glow in the otherwise dim room as she read the message. It was precisely what she had expected. Polite, vague, and disappointingly dismissive. The airline thanked her for bringing the matter to their attention, assured her that an internal investigation was underway, and promised a review of their customer service standards. The closing sentiment was as familiar as it was hollow. We appreciate your feedback and are committed to ensuring a positive experience for all passengers. Juliet stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. The response was neither surprising nor satisfying. It was designed to placate, to offer a hollow acknowledgement of her concerns without addressing the substance of what she had experienced. She forwarded the email to Charles, adding a brief note. Exactly what we anticipated. The reply came swiftly. This is a delay tactic. They're hoping you'll let it go. Time for the next step. And so, the next step was taken. Through Sophie's connections, a formal meeting with representatives from the airline was arranged. It was scheduled for the following morning at an anonymous office building on the outskirts of Paris. Juliet spent the night preparing herself, reviewing her notes, compiling the evidence she had gathered, and carefully reflecting on the steps she would take. Her detailed account of the flight, the testimonials of other passengers, and the growing support she had garnered in the public sphere would form the foundation of her case. She would not let this be ignored. The next morning, she arrived at the office building. The room was exactly as she had imagined it: neutral-toned walls, a polished conference table, and a carafe of water flanked by disposable cups. Seated across from her were two men and a woman, each in corporate attire that exuded professionalism but lacked warmth. The woman introduced herself as Laura Hastings, a senior representative in customer relations. The men gave their names but offered no titles, an intentional move to keep their roles deliberately ambiguous. Juliet greeted them with calm politeness. Her composure, measured but undeniable, was her quiet strength in the face of the cold professionalism that surrounded her. Laura began with the expected apologies, expressing regret for Juliet's experience and assuring her that the airline took such matters seriously. "We want to make it clear," Laura said, her tone carefully calibrated, "that this behavior does not reflect our company's values." Juliet nodded slightly, her gaze unwavering. And yet it happened. The room stilled. The weight of her words hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Laura cleared her throat, but Juliet knew the discomfort she had created was unavoidable. The representative pressed on, outlining the steps the airline claimed to be taking. A review of the incident, a temporary reassignment for Clara while the investigation continued, and an evaluation of their training programs. Juliet listened without interrupting. She gave nothing away, no satisfaction, no frustration, just a quiet presence, absorbing each word. When Laura finally finished, Juliet leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table, her voice even and controlled. "I appreciate your response," she said calmly, "but I have to ask, how many complaints like mine have you received before? How many were quietly filed away without meaningful action?" Laura's composure faltered, just for a moment. There was a crack in her professional veneer. "I can't speak to that directly," she replied, her voice less certain, "but I can assure you that we're committed to addressing this." Juliet nodded again, her gesture more an acknowledgement of the insufficiency than agreement. "I've heard from others who've experienced similar treatment, some by Clara, others by different members of your staff. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern." The tension in the room thickened. One of the men, the older of the two, leaned forward. His tone was measured, trying to maintain control. "Miss Davis, we're doing everything we can to resolve this matter, but we also hope you understand that systemic change takes time." Juliet met his gaze with quiet firmness. "Time is a luxury for those who don't have to live with the consequences," she replied. Her voice remained steady, but there was a steeliness in her words that made it clear. This fight was not just for her. It was for everyone who had been silenced by systems of discrimination. It was a fight for change, and she would not back down. "Miss Davis, we're doing everything we can to resolve this matter, but we also hope you understand that systemic change takes time." The older man's voice was calm, measured, trying to mitigate the discomfort of the moment. Juliet met his gaze with unwavering resolve. Her voice was steady, but every word was imbued with purpose. "Time is a luxury for those who don't have to live with the consequences," she replied. "This isn't just about my flight. It's about the countless others who didn't or couldn't speak up. It's about the people whose voices were ignored, whose experiences were dismissed simply because they lacked the weight of a public platform. This is bigger than just one incident. This is about a system that has allowed this behavior to persist unchecked, not just for Clara, but for many others. The man leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat, exchanging a glance with her colleagues before turning back to Juliet. "What do you want from us, Miss Davis?" Laura asked, her tone now more guarded, yet still attempting to maintain control of the conversation. Juliet didn't hesitate. Her words came with the force of conviction, the clarity of someone who had made up her mind. "Transparency and accountability," she said firmly. "Not just for Clara, but for the entire system that allowed her behavior to go unchecked. I want tangible changes, not just in how you respond to complaints, but in how you train and support your staff to prevent this from happening in the first place. I want to see a culture shift, not just a temporary reassignment or internal review. This isn't a matter of good intentions. It's about concrete action." For a long moment, the room was silent. The weight of her words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge to the carefully constructed walls of corporate indifference. Juliet sat poised, her posture dignified, her expression resolute. She wasn't here to negotiate. She wasn't here to be placated. She was here to demand action. The meeting ended with vague promises, assurances of policy reviews, commitments to implement changes, and a pledge to keep her updated on the progress of the investigation. But Juliet left the sterile conference room with no illusions. Promises were easy to make. The real challenge was turning words into action. That evening, back in her hotel room, Juliet sat at the desk, staring at her phone. The weight of the day settled on her shoulders, but she refused to let it crush her. She opened her notebook and began writing another statement. This one was for herself, an internal reflection, a way to organize her thoughts and reaffirm her purpose. She wrote about the meeting, the polite deflections, the reluctance in their eyes, the hollow assurances that masked a deeper unwillingness to truly address the root cause of the issue. She wrote about the burden of expectations placed on those who dared to challenge systems built to silence them, who dared to question the status quo. And then, as the city outside settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Juliet wrote about hope. Not the naive, wishful kind that expected immediate results, but the quiet, enduring kind that believed in persistence. The kind that understood change was a slow process, but one that was still possible. The kind of hope that burned in her chest and fueled her determination to see this through. She closed the notebook, placing it beside her on the table. Tomorrow would come, and with it another step forward. The next morning, Juliet sat in a quiet cafe in Paris, her coffee growing cold beside her. She wasn't paying attention to the bustling activity around her, the tourists snapping photos, the locals conversing in soft French, the occasional burst of laughter carried on the breeze. She was lost in thought, her phone resting on the table, the screen alive with a flood of notifications. Her story had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just about her. The narrative had shifted. It was now a broader conversation about racial bias in customer service, a dialogue that had sparked across social media and news outlets worldwide. Juliet scrolled through the headlines with a calm expression, though beneath her stillness, her heart raced. She had known this would happen, but that didn't make it any less overwhelming. The messages flooded in, some from strangers sharing their own stories of discrimination, others offering support, some simply expressing gratitude for her courage. But, as expected, there were also voices of skepticism, people questioning her motives, dismissing her experience as exaggerated. It wasn't the first time she had faced doubt, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But one message stood out. A simple one, from a former flight attendant who had worked for the same airline. "Thank you for speaking up," it read. "People like Clara have been allowed to act this way for years because the system protects them. Maybe now, things will finally change." Juliet set her phone down and stared out the window at the cobblestone street. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing against her chest. But it wasn't unwelcome. She had chosen this path, knowing the road would be difficult, knowing the outcome was uncertain. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the effort, the act of standing up, of refusing to remain silent. Later that evening, Juliet met with Sophie and Charles at a small bistro tucked away from the busy streets of Paris. The table was lit by the soft glow of a candle, and the conversation flowed easily, punctuated only by the occasional clink of silverware from nearby diners. But the topic of their conversation was far from casual. "They're stalling," Charles said, his voice steady but resolute. "The airline's response is vague by design. They're hoping the public attention will fade before they're forced to make real changes." Juliet nodded, her expression calm but focused. "I expected as much." Sophie leaned in, her face serious. "I've been talking to people in the industry. There's more to this than Clara's behavior. The airline has a history of dismissing complaints like yours. If we can gather enough evidence, we can show that this isn't an isolated incident. It's systemic." Juliet's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, her mind racing as she considered Sophie's words. The idea of turning her experience into a broader investigation felt daunting, but also necessary. It wasn't enough to address just her own situation. She needed to shine a light on the larger issue, the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. Charles chimed in, his voice firm. "I've been compiling statements from passengers who witnessed what happened on your flight. A few are willing to go on record. If we combine that with accounts from former employees, we'll have a strong case." Juliet met his gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. "Then let's do it. If they won't take responsibility willingly, we'll make it impossible for them to ignore." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Juliet worked with Sophie and Charles to draft a formal complaint, one that went beyond her individual experience. It outlined the broader pattern of discrimination within the airline, supported by testimonials and documentation. This wasn't just a demand for accountability. It was a call for systemic reform. When the document was ready, they submitted it not only to the airline, but to regulatory bodies and advocacy organizations that could amplify its impact. Juliet knew this would escalate the situation, but she welcomed the challenge. She reminded herself that silence was the ally of injustice. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure began to mount. News outlets continued to cover the story, and public scrutiny of the airline intensified. Former employees came forward with their own accounts, painting a picture of a corporate culture that tolerated and at times enabled discriminatory behavior. Juliet read their stories with a mix of sadness and determination. She wasn't alone in this fight, and that gave her strength. One afternoon, she received a call from Robert Langston, the airline's head of customer relations. His tone was markedly different from their initial conversation, less polished, more urgent. "Miss Davis," he began, his voice carrying a weight of seriousness she hadn't heard before, "we've been reviewing the evidence you submitted, and I want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously. Changes are already underway." "Miss Davis, we've reviewed the evidence you submitted, and I want to assure you that we take this very seriously. Changes are already underway." Robert Langston's voice on the other end of the line was smooth, practiced, yet there was a sense of urgency lurking beneath the polished exterior. Juliet listened silently, her expression calm, absorbing every word. When he finished, she responded, her tone unwavering and filled with quiet conviction. "Mr. Langston, words are easy," she said, each syllable carrying the weight of her resolve. "What I want to see are your actions, concrete steps to ensure this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone." There was a pause on the line, then Langston hurried to reassure her. "We're implementing mandatory bias training for all staff. We're revising our complaint review process to ensure greater transparency. This is just the beginning." Juliet held her ground, not letting the initial response sway her. She let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in before replying. "That's a start, but it's not enough. Accountability doesn't end with training. It requires a culture shift, one that ensures people like Clara are held responsible for their actions. One that actively supports the employees who do the right thing, not the ones who turn a blind eye." On the other end, Langston was silent for a beat, and Juliet could almost feel him digesting her words. She knew he was listening, but whether or not he was ready to agree, she couldn't be sure. As the call ended, Juliet felt a strange sense of clarity wash over her. This fight wasn't about her reputation or even about one airline. It was about challenging the quiet, pervasive systems that allowed prejudice to thrive unchecked. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. It was about creating a world where such voices would no longer need to shout to be heard. That night, as the lights of Paris shimmered outside her hotel room, Juliet sat with her notebook once again. Her pen moved steadily across the page, writing not a conclusion, but a beginning. Change is slow, it is messy, uncomfortable. But it is also inevitable when enough voices demand it. Today I added mine. Tomorrow I will do it again. The next morning, Juliet stood in her studio, the soft light filtering through the tall windows. The table before her was cluttered with swatches of fabric, sketches for her upcoming collection. But her mind wasn't on her designs. It was elsewhere. Her phone buzzed on the desk nearby, its notification cutting through the quiet. The airline had just released a statement addressing the situation. She picked up the phone, reading the carefully worded message. The airline apologized for her experience, acknowledged systemic shortcomings, and outlined steps they claimed were already underway. Mandatory bias training, an overhaul of their complaint system, and an independent review of workplace culture. It was progress, but Juliet knew better than to be fooled by words alone. The statement had already sparked debate. Some praised the airline for publicly addressing the issue, while others questioned whether the promises would lead to real change. Juliet felt the tension in those responses, skepticism warring with hope. It was a familiar tug-of-war. As she set the phone down, her thoughts drifted to the broader ripple effect of her actions. What had started as a personal ordeal was now part of a much larger conversation, one that extended far beyond a single flight or a single airline. Later that day, she met with Charles and Sophie at a modest cafe not far from her studio. Their discussions had become a regular occurrence, a collaboration born of shared purpose. Charles arrived first, his notepad already open, his pen poised. "I've been reviewing the airline's statement," he said, settling into his seat. "It's a start, but it's vague. No timeline, no specifics. They're leaving themselves room to maneuver." Juliet nodded, unfazed. "Then we keep the pressure on. The promises they've made need to be measured against their actions. We can't let them off the hook that easily." Sophie arrived moments later, her energy brisk and determined. "You'll be glad to know your story is inspiring others," she said, taking her seat. "I've been contacted by several advocacy groups looking to collaborate. They want to use your platform to push for industry-wide changes." Juliet sipped her coffee, letting Sophie's words sink in. She hadn't set out to become an advocate, but now the role seemed inevitable. There was a quiet power in knowing that her voice could amplify those who had been unheard for too long. The following week, Juliet was invited to speak at a summit hosted by Aviation for Equality, a non-profit organization advocating for diversity and inclusion in the airline industry. The event would be held in London, gathering industry leaders, employees, and activists from around the globe. Public speaking had never been her strength. Her voice had always been her work, her designs, the language she spoke fluently. But this felt different. It felt necessary. When she arrived at the summit, the atmosphere was electric. Executives sat alongside flight attendants. Journalists mingled with grassroots organizers. The diversity in the audience reflected the change the summit hoped to inspire. When Juliet's name was called, the applause was warm, but measured. She walked to the podium with a calm demeanor, her notes tucked neatly in her hand. For a moment, she stood in silence, letting the room settle. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't come here today as an expert or an activist. I came as someone who experienced a moment that reflected something much larger, something that affects us all, a system that, in both subtle and overt ways, often excludes rather than includes." The room fell silent. The audience leaned in, drawn in by her presence. "What happened to me on that flight," Juliet continued, "was not unique. It was a symptom of a culture that allows bias to persist, unchecked and unchallenged. And while it would be easy to focus on one person's behavior, the truth is, this isn't about one person. It's about the structures and practices that allowed that behavior to feel permissible." She spoke about her experience, not in anger, but with clarity, her personal story woven into the larger narrative of systemic inequity. She acknowledged the complexities of change, the resistance it often faced, and the discomfort it could bring. But she also emphasized the necessity of that discomfort, the way it signaled growth. "We cannot fix what we refuse to confront," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "And we cannot confront it alone. Change requires collective effort, accountability, and the courage to listen to voices that have been ignored for too long." When she finished, the applause was louder, more sustained. It wasn't the kind of applause reserved for entertainment. It was the kind that signaled understanding, agreement, and perhaps even hope. In the days that followed, Juliet received messages from attendees, many expressing gratitude for her candor. But one message stood out. It was from Tanisha, a flight attendant who had reached out months earlier. "I wanted to thank you again," the message read. "What you've started has given people like me the courage to speak out. My colleagues and I have formed a network to advocate for fair treatment in our industry. We're small, but we're growing." Juliet replied immediately, her words simple but heartfelt. "Your courage inspires me. Thank you for continuing the fight." As she sat in her studio later that evening, Juliet reflected on the path that had brought her here. What had begun as a personal fight for dignity had grown into something larger, a movement that was beginning to take shape. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, she felt a sense of shared momentum. Outside, the lights of Paris began to twinkle, and Juliet allowed herself a quiet moment of gratitude. Change, she reminded herself, was not measured in grand gestures alone. It was built in the steady, unyielding steps of those who refused to be silent. And today, she had taken another step forward. The train to Charles de Gaulle Airport moved smoothly through the Paris suburbs, the soft rhythm of the rails a backdrop to Juliet's thoughts. She sat by the window, her carry-on neatly stowed beside her, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. It had been months since that fateful flight, but the journey it had set in motion was far from over. Today, she was traveling to Cape Town, where she would address a global human rights conference, a platform she had never imagined herself occupying. Her phone buzzed softly. A message from Tanisha appeared on the screen. "Good luck today. Your words have already inspired so many. You've inspired me." Juliet smiled, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she replied, "Thank you, Tanisha. This is just the beginning, for all of us." The flight to Cape Town was uneventful, almost startlingly so. The cabin crew was professional, attentive without being overbearing. Juliet observed their interactions with passengers, noting the quiet care in their gestures and the sincerity in their voices. It was a subtle but unmistakable contrast to her previous experience, and she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. As the plane descended toward the sprawling city, Juliet felt a quiet resolve settle within her. This wasn't about personal vindication. It hadn't been for a long time. This was about creating space for others to be seen, heard, and respected. The conference venue was bathed in sunlight, the open space bathed in warmth, with Table Mountain standing sentinel in the distance. The audience was a tapestry of cultures, backgrounds, and perspectives. Each person there shared a deep, unwavering commitment to a more just and equitable world. Juliet stood backstage, her hands resting lightly on the podium she would soon stand behind. As the murmurs in the room began to fade, she could feel the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't just her stage, it was a stage for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside. When her name was called, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't for her, she thought. It was for the idea of change she had come to represent. Juliet stepped forward, her movements deliberate, her expression calm but assured. The spotlight warmed her face, but her focus remained unwavering. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "I stand before you today not as an expert or an advocate, but as someone who has lived the experience of exclusion firsthand. I stand before you as someone who has been part of the system, someone who has felt the subtle and overt ways in which systems can diminish, dismiss, and silence." The room fell into a hushed silence. Juliet's words carried across the space with quiet force. "My story began on a flight, but it is not unique," she continued. "It is part of a larger narrative, a history of moments, large and small, where dignity is questioned, where belonging is challenged, often in ways so ingrained that they go unnoticed. But what happens when we notice? When we refuse to look away?" She paused, allowing her words to sink in, the weight of the question hanging in the air. "What I have learned is this. Change begins in the quiet moments. It begins when we choose to confront what is uncomfortable, when we decide that small injustices are no longer small enough to ignore. Change begins with courage, not the loud kind that seeks attention, but the quiet kind that insists on action, that demands accountability, and that refuses to let things remain the way they are." As Juliet continued, she spoke not only of her experience, but also of the broader systems that perpetuated exclusion. She emphasized the necessity of accountability, the power of collective effort, and the urgent need for systemic change. She outlined tangible steps: transparent policies, equitable training, and the creation of spaces where diversity was not just included, but celebrated. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But Juliet's mind wasn't on the noise. It wasn't about her. It was about the faces in the audience, the expressions etched with determination, empathy, and hope. She had done what she came to do, not to solve the problem, but to ignite a spark. The solutions, she knew, were for others to carry forward. In the days following the conference, Juliet met with activists, industry leaders, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by her story. Each conversation reaffirmed her belief that change, though slow, was possible. She returned to Paris with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue the work she had started, knowing that this was only the beginning. Months later, Juliette stood in her studio, surrounded by her team. The empowerment line, her new fashion collection, was nearing completion. Each piece carried a story of resilience, of unity, of quiet defiance against a world that too often sought to divide. The collection was more than just fashion. Proceeds would fund scholarships and mentorship programs, creating opportunities for those who had long been excluded from industries like fashion and aviation. One dress, in particular, caught Juliette's eye. It was a flowing design, inspired by the wings of a bird, its fabric shifting from deep blue to vibrant orange. It symbolized, she explained to her team, what could be achieved when people chose to rise together. As the launch approached, Juliette received an unexpected letter. It was from Robert Langston, the airline executive she had sparred with months earlier. She opened the letter, reading his words carefully. "Miss Davis," it began, "I wanted to thank you, not just for holding us accountable, but for inspiring real change. The reforms you advocated for are not just words on paper. They are shaping how we train, how we listen, and how we act. I hope this note serves as a reminder that your voice matters, and it always will." Juliette set the letter down, her expression thoughtful. It wasn't the end, she knew. It was just a marker of progress. The real work would lie in ensuring that these reforms endured, that they became the foundation for something greater. Years later, Juliette found herself on another stage, accepting an award for her contributions to social justice. As she looked out at the audience, a sea of faces representing countless stories, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. "Injustice," she began, her voice steady and strong, "is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of change. What we do in response defines not only who we are, but the world we wish to create." The applause was a wave washing over her, but she stood quietly, her heart full of gratitude. She had set out to reclaim her dignity, but what she had found was a purpose far greater than herself. And as the applause faded, Juliette knew her journey was far from over. She had ignited a movement. She had given a voice to the silenced. But the work was just beginning. Juliette stood on the stage, watching the applause subside. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging. There were still many battles to be fought, many barriers to break down. But as she looked out at the faces in the audience, she felt a sense of unity that transcended all boundaries. People were listening. They were ready for change. Her journey had started with a single, quiet act of defiance. But now it had become something much larger, a movement, a collective effort that was making ripples across industries and communities. Juliette knew that the path to lasting change was long and winding. But for the first time, she felt that the momentum was on her side. As the night drew to a close, Juliette walked off the stage, her heart filled with gratitude, her mind focused on the road ahead. This was only the beginning, and she would continue to walk that path step by step toward a future where no one would have to fight for their dignity ever again. Let me know in the comments below which one of these enjoyed the video. Remember to leave a like, subscribe, and ring that bell icon so you never miss our upcoming videos. Stay tuned, and we will catch you in the next video. Take care. Thanks for watching.